we're ever indebted to Helena and Local Futures and the Economics of Happiness conference group. And we are more than happy to have Helena with us this morning here from Sydney. Thank you so much, Helena, for joining us, and I leave it to you to carry on.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm very, very happy to hear that our bigger picture was helpful for you in terms of moving forward to really a life that I think most human beings long for, and that is a life that very importantly encourages and creates intergenerational community and a deep connection to the rest of life, to the animals, to the plants, to the water, to the soil that nourish us and of which we are a part. So it's about deeply reconnecting to life. And it's, I think one of the reasons there are not so many people teaching this perspective is that the spiritual teachings we have, most of the wisdom and spiritual teachings that have been passed down over hundreds of years, they started at a time when people lived in that way. All around the world, before the modern economy, the majority of people lived in much more interdependent, human scale, intergenerational communities. So the old and the young mixing together, and they lived in deep connection and collaboration with the rest of life that they knew and they could see that that's what supports them. And so they also had more sane and supportive relationship to nature. So I think what happened is that the spiritual teachers came out with this great wisdom of how can we prevent people from becoming greedy and prevent people from thinking they can control the earth and be masters over life. How can we teach people that we are inextricably part of life? How can we teach people to be more in the present, to pay attention to their inner signals, to their hearts and their bodies as well as their minds? The teachings, emphasize living in the present, understanding that everything is connected, that ultimately there is no separate, static anything. Now, those wisdom teachings didn't include reminding people that they should be in community and connected to nature, because that's how people lived. So that was taken for granted. These teachings came in to remind people that this is how we need to live, and this is who we are. It was a reminder of the reality of the living world. With very powerful traders that were able to invade other places and forcing people into producing for them, enslaving people, killing off people, whole populations. Now, from that economic stranglehold has arisen a modern economic system that really has continued to ignore the truth about interdependence, the reality of how people and the earth function. Is continue to move more and more in the direction of supporting an artificial system, especially since the Second World War. This system has been boosted by a lot of oil, and a lot of oil that wasn't cheap, but governments went along with using this energy to impose a type of agriculture that replaced people. So the slaves were now replaced by lots of oil and machinery, and everywhere in the modern era, the idea was that this monoculture, using lots of energy and machines, was more efficient and that it was more productive and that we needed to move in that direction in order to relieve people of drudgery and of a very hard life. So we, in my organization, Local Futures, we ended up from this deep experience of Ladakh that most of you will have heard of, even though most of you probably haven't been there. And high up on the Tibetan plateau, this culture was able to escape the impact of colonialism and even of modern development, because it was so remote. And then in the modern era, the Indian government was worried about the Chinese coming in on one side, the Pakistanis on the other side. So all the borders were protected and people weren't allowed to go there, essentially. And then in the mid-70s, they threw it open, mainly probably to make sure that the world knew that this part of Tibet belonged to India. And I came out there as one of the first outsiders, and I was only going to be there for 6 weeks to help make a documentary about this traditional culture that had been so unchanged. And I just fell in love. I had never ever met people who seemed so deeply at peace and so full of vitality and joy. I never had ever been in a culture where the balance between human and nature was so balanced, where the balance between masculine and feminine and men and women was so balanced. And also, in some ways, one of the most beautiful aspects of this way of life was also this deep connection between the very oldest and the very youngest. So it was a remarkably peaceful and joyful culture, and I fell in love with it, and I ended up giving up my job in Paris, and I started doing research on the language, and I was told I could do a degree, a thesis on the Ladakhi language at the University of London. So that gave me the excuse to stay, and then when I went through the region, and I just, from everybody I heard that there was no hunger, that they had what they called, tumbos, zabos, which meant plenty to eat, plenty to drink. I didn't see any signs of real poverty. And there was no such thing as unemployment. There was no such thing really as pollution as we know it. So in a very short time, I became aware that it was tragic that the Indian government was starting to develop Ladakh in the conventional way, using fossil fuels, and realizing that Ladakh had 300 days or more every year of sunshine. I wrote to the government, very much inspired by the German economist named Schumacher, who had written a book called Small is Beautiful. And he had himself had very similar experience when he went to Burma in the 1950s. And he there discovered also people who were remarkably peaceful, no real poverty. So he had to rethink all his assumptions about development, about growth, about the economy. And when he wrote the book Small is Beautiful, he was saying we need a very different approach, and that human scale, smaller scale, more decentralized development was essential in order to maintain both the social well-being and the ecological well-being. So having read that book when I was in Ladakh, that gave me the courage to write to the Indian government and say, wouldn't it make sense to do a development that would be based on what Gandhi had been saying and what Schumacher is saying now? And can we start some projects to demonstrate solar energy? And then I was able to start very simple projects using mainly passive solar, which can make a huge difference, especially there in a cold climate. You could use just simple mud walls and some glass and paint and really provide heat in the winter. I was doing this not as an outsider coming in to try to improve Ladakh, which I think would be a very big and dangerous agenda, because what they were doing, they've been doing for hundreds and thousands of years. So for me to think, well, I'm going to improve Ladakh would have been very arrogant. But I was doing it as an alternative to massive changes that were coming in, particularly, as I said, based on fossil fuels. But not just fossil fuels, pesticides that had been outlawed in the West, asbestos. We built a hospital with a lot of asbestos after it was already outlawed in the West. And then people found little bits of broken asbestos. They were baking their bread on it. And so it was clearly such a big role as a Westerner to provide information, to really provide information about changes that came from the West that were coming into Ladakh without any information of their impact in the West. So demonstrating solar as an alternative to fossil fuels made a lot of sense. And local leaders became very interested. We started something called a Ladakh Ecological Development Group. And this work became quite well known, and we won an alternative Nobel Prize for it. And then we were invited to Bhutan to do similar work. But very early on, I became aware that if the West didn't change, and if awareness in the West, especially among well-intentioned Westerners, if they didn't become aware of how destructive Western-style development can be, and how many people with very good intentions were actually imposing a knowledge system, a schooling system, and everything from seeds to other technologies, introducing them with the idea of improving, but not realizing at all the value of what was there before, and not realizing that diversity is a fact of life. Diversity in everything that is thriving, whether in forests or on farms or in fisheries, nature is diverse. Every single seed is different from every other seed. Every leaf is different. And what had happened was that in the West, scientific research that isolated living things from the rest of life were becoming more and more destructive in producing things for profit and things that were supposed to be relevant across the entire world. So introducing monocultural species and a human monoculture all over the world. So I ended up trying to do what I could, mainly through speaking. I did talks in all over Europe, in America, and trying to raise awareness about the need to really profoundly question this monolithic, top-down system that was influencing people all across the world. And I started probably already in the early 80s. Probably even before that. I became a defender of local knowledge, of local species, of local cultures, of diversity. And then later on, I learned that there was a process called globalization that was going on that I hadn't known about in the early, probably when I first started. So not until the 80s had I heard about globalization. Then I learned that there was this process of trade treaties that were giving global seed companies, global construction companies, global pharmaceutical companies, global banks, global everything. They were getting more and more freedom to go in and out of every economy around the world. And this is happening in the name of free trade treaties. Treaties where governments were sitting around a table with big business and being asked to open up their countries, their resources, their labor to these global corporations. I came to understand that a lot of this had started right after the Second World War, when people were worried about another world war, they were worried about another depression. So there were a lot of idealistic politicians and business people who thought the way to avoid another war and the way to avoid another depression is that we harmonize or we integrate all economic activity around the world. And so we'll set up a World Bank, we'll set up the IMF, and we'll have a process of trade liberalization so everything can be integrated. And that was called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And really, clearly, there was a lot of idealism behind it. And there were clearly also very big businesses, already global, that benefited from this, because they were being given the freedom to do as they like. And really what's happened is that, particularly since the 80s, but already starting with the Second World War, and in some ways even before that, what was happening is that these big businesses were becoming monopolies. They were so big and so powerful that they could afford to go into a country and offer their products at a lower price until they destroyed the competitors. They were so powerful that they were able to lobby governments to bring in regulations nationally so that the small businesses, the medium-sized businesses that were operating, even the large ones, operating within the national arena, they suddenly had to have all kinds of special regulations in the name often of public safety and health and so on. But because the global corporations didn't have to adhere to those rules, it meant that much unhealthier and really bad practices were able to flourish economically. And because they had the freedom to come into every nation, every region, every local economy, they could destroy the fabric of smaller businesses. It became obvious that we have this very artificial economy, and that if we don't wake up to this, and if we don't start strengthening local economies, supporting localization, we are destroying ecosystems and we're destroying cultures. Another major aspect to my work was that in Ladakh I had seen, as I said before, that people were so happy and so at peace. And I saw that that had to do with very deep self-confidence, self-esteem. And then I saw how this Western system coming in, driven by the economy, in the Western school and now in the town where everybody had to go if they wanted to get a job, suddenly what you saw was that starting with young people, people developed a sense of inferiority. The school books and the media and the advertising and the experts were all telling the Ladakhis that they were backward and primitive. And it became this new vision that if you were progressive, and that meant if you were important and if you deserved people's respect, you were in the city. You wouldn't be seen dead as a farmer. Farming became a sign of being backward, primitive, poor, stupid. So I saw also that this is reinforced by media images and even toys that romanticize Barbie for girls and Rambos with machine guns for the boys. And along with that came also violent films romanticizing war. And And of course, later on, computer games romanticizing this kind of war and violence. So I became also aware that as this psychological pressure, ultimately from the global economy, had an impact on children, it led to epidemics of depression, anxiety, even suicide. So when I went back to Sweden, and I had been very critical of how the role models, Barbie doll was blonde and blue-eyed, and I had heard my Ladakhi friends say, oh, it's much better to be Western, and much better to be taller and have light skin, and I realized how unbelievably destructive this centralized, top-down system was. So in the beginning, I used to talk about how the problem was that it's, promoting blonde, blue-eyed Western role models and destroying everybody else. Then I went back to Sweden and I realized that in Sweden at that time, blonde, blue-eyed girls were starving themselves, sometimes to death, because they felt they weren't thin enough. So I came to realize that this was really a global problem, and that the problem was this top-down artificial images of who you should be. And what was being destroyed was that children everywhere, from Bangalore to Sweden, would base their identity on living role models, real people, not some kind of screen, not some kind of distant idea or image. And I came to realize that when we base our role models on real people, we are dealing with the reality of imperfection. We're not trying to pretend that we're perfect. We can't, because we're close enough to know what people are like. We know that nobody's perfect. So I also, with all of this over the years, I've come to realize that in the West in particular, but it's happening in India now too, because of this economic system, we're being herded away from intergenerational community and into smaller and smaller nuclear families. And this is all part of this urbanizing path where really, if we don't wake up and do something, we're going to be talking about 100% urbanization. Just the other day, an expert in England, a high-level expert, advising the Treasury, his name was Tim Lernig, and he announced that, well, farming only contributes 1% to GDP, so let's stop farming. Why are we farming? It's not contributing to GDP. Let's do like Singapore and just import our food. Now, this is certainly not an evil man, but from my point of view, what he's saying is evil. It is so blind, it is so out of touch with the real world that you could call him a psychopath. But it's a psychopath that's quite different from what we normally mean by that word. This is someone who's not even thinking about, so who are going to be these farmers then who are going to be producing the food for the English? Why shouldn't the English produce their own food? Why shouldn't they take responsibility for that? And why shouldn't they also have the privilege of being more self-reliant so that they don't have to depend on giant infrastructures that we now see with the virus are very vulnerable? Why shouldn't every human being, every community, every country have the right to produce a diversity of things for their own needs, starting with food, which is the most important thing we produce. Nothing else that we produce, every person on the planet needs every day. We don't produce water, not yet, thank God. But, we are now beholden to a blind idea about trade that goes way back to the powerful traders. This idea of promoting ever more global trade so that countries are importing and exporting the same product. and artificially lowering the price of imported products and raising the price of local products, destroying millions, billions of farmers, and with it smaller shops, smaller towns. We really, really urgently need a wake up. I touched on the human destruction and on the destruction of nature, and I think that I was thinking of maybe stopping there for some questions. A lot more to say, but shall we take some questions now, do you think? Can't hear you.
Now? Am I audible?
Sorry?
Am I audible now?
Sorry?
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible now, yes.
All right. Okay, we can take some questions and then we can continue.
Yeah.
So to all the participants, there's a small hand icon on your screen, a small palm icon on your screen. If you have any questions, please do.
Or comments too.
Yeah, comments, questions, please do raise your hand and we can surely take those questions in there. And if you have any questions, also please do type in there. So I will take the first question from architect Satya Prakash Varnashi, who introduced us to the Economics of Happiness conference in Bangalore. Thank you, sir, for being here. So his question is, how do we make a distinction between the local materials and the locally available materials now that nearly everything is available everywhere?
Yes, that's a good point. So we are insisting that the big shift that has to happen is an awakening to the fact that the real economy is the living earth. Everything we use comes from the living earth. Everything. So that is our economy, if you like. It's our mother. It's our breath. It's our bodies. We are part of it. Now, economically speaking, local building materials would be building materials from the region. And so we don't call something local that has been transported in from, far away, or something that's been manufactured by giant industries and then delivered using artificially cheap energy. To make the shift we need to make is, of course, not always easy, particularly in the city. It can be very hard to get a hold of those more local, natural materials. But what we need is a clear vision. So for us, the number one step really is a big wake up. We have to be aware that we have been trained into a more narrow urbanizing perspective. And I would argue that this blindness is the main problem we face. I'm absolutely convinced that the majority of people in big business as well as smaller would agree that we need to make a turn away from this rapid, energy-intensive, globalizing path. Once they really see the global impact, and once they become familiar with the benefits of the localization movement, actually real, practical, concrete benefits. But see, this even includes that in Germany, I was told recently by an architect, they've come to realize that timber is far safer in fire than steel. They've come to realize that solid wooden beams, even for high-rise buildings, is safer than steel, that the steel melts and that it just gets destroyed much faster. Now, that's something that, a lot of people wouldn't know about, partly because we're so enmeshed in this big business view of the world. We've been seeing the world through the needs of big business because big business has had so much influence in terms of shaping the agenda at schools and universities. And we don't realize that we're so lost. So again, it's a lot about rethinking. Now, at the very grassroots, the very bottom of the ladder, what I feel so happy about is knowing of lots of grassroots projects where mud is being used all around the world, mud. And it can literally be used everywhere. And of course, maybe there are some places where bamboo or wood or other local materials would be better. But mud is really globally available in most places. And what's so wonderful there too is that the building skills and so on are being taught in the permaculture movement and so on. It's something that people really enjoy. So I'm seeing lots of very promising grassroots trends. But then, of course, it's another question: how do we translate that into meaningful, serious policy change? And we can talk more about that later. I don't know. Maybe I should address it right now. Maybe I'll address it right now because I'm, going all over the place. So we're trying to encourage people now, once we sketch out this sort of global direction versus the local, which in this time of COVID is incredibly important that we be very, very aware of these two very distinct paths. One of us taking us further into this globalizing economic trajectory, the other one taking us back home towards more localized systems. Now, as we go local, we come closer to our community and closer to nature. And this, we are convinced, is in our DNA. This is how we evolved. Closer to community, closer to nature. This time on Earth that we've been so far removed from nature and from our community and a real sense of community, a real interdependence among people. That is like a tiny bleep. It's like a second in a 24-hour evolution. It is so tiny. So we mustn't be caught up in the idea that this is so big, and we mustn't think this techno-economic path is somehow inevitable or evolutionary or too big to change. It's being changed from the ground up, and there's so much evidence. So we try to encourage people to really look very clearly, to take particularly this pause that COVID is imposing, to take the time to really think this through. Don't expect people to believe me, but if on our website, localfutures.org, you'll find reading materials, you'll find a lot, if you look deeper, that will reinforce what I'm saying, mostly, not all of it, but so rethinking. And then we urge people to, even now in lockdown, think about the action they're going to want to take once the crisis is over. And then we urge people to be looking at supporting or starting localization initiatives. There's a whole range of things there, in food, in shelter, energy, education, healthcare, support or start initiatives there. But also, at least, I also want to say first that we're urging everyone to make systemic change, to change the I to a we. So even if you just connect with a few like-minded people is the best way to start. Some friends or colleagues or neighbors or family members who really do want to rethink and who realize we are facing more and more trouble and crises, and make it a joint journey with them. We change the I to a we, and then in that group, ideally someone will also have time to be looking at the policy change we need. So we can take action, and usually the action, the local initiatives that are really about localization. It's not just about local action. It's not just about linking up with local people. It's about understanding localization as a systemic part. But when we engage with that, we usually find that we have so much more energy and so much more hope because it's healthy. It's supporting us psychologically, spiritually, socially, ecologically, and even economically. And that doesn't always happen overnight. But in the local food movement, we're amazed at how healing it is on all those levels, really. So we urge people to do that, but have the strength and the courage to look at that bigger picture and to start talking about the policy change we need. And so the first thing we need is to recognize that the economic direction towards mass urbanization and total destruction of rural livelihoods all of this is coming about because government mechanisms of what is taxed, what's subsidized, and what's regulated. What kind of regulations and laws are they supporting? And in doing what they're doing now, they're all rolling out a red carpet for monopolies, and these monopolies are struggling to survive. They're having to merge, and they're not even big enough. If you're Exxon, you go to Mobil, and that means big cities will be fast and very, very insecure. So spending this to change the regulations at the global level, to take democracy back, to say, no, we want actually democratic process to shape business rather than business shaping society, business owning and dominating the seeds and the pharmaceuticals and every aspect of our life. So how do we do that? We need to demand, as Extinction Rebellion did in England, that the movements, the social environmental movements should be at the table. There has to be transparency right down to the grassroots. Then we need, and it could happen almost overnight if people just wake up, immediately we would stop all the subsidies and all the shifts that are pushing people into bigger and bigger cities that are absolute nightmares socially and ecologically. They create a situation where we're on top of one another. We have no more social interdependence. We just go past each other. We don't even say hello. It's a completely unnatural situation. So in those big cities where localization is happening, people are starting to connect with each other. They're starting to collaborate on community gardens or setting up a local food scheme or a local energy. So even within the cities, people are making the changes that we need to do. But overall, we want to stop the growth of these mega cities as soon as possible and support smaller towns, smaller villages, medium-sized cities to develop in a way that maintains the balance of the land and that maintains the accountable and visible, more human scale chains of connection. So that the policies that we need to change there are many of them, but they include deregulating a lot of restrictions on small farmers, on restaurants, on food economies at the local level. There are a lot of regulations that are very counterproductive. So instead of having a system where we deregulate global and regulate local and national, we're reversing that. We're going to be regulating the global and deregulating after careful thought and looking at where it makes sense, the local, regional, and even national to some extent. So the same thing with taxes. Right now, everybody at the national arena is squeezed for taxes, and in the meanwhile, the global players don't pay tax. So another very important part of the policy change, very, very central, is money. Who makes money actually creates the money. People don't think about that, and they don't realize that it's become more and more and more deregulated. So the nation state doesn't have the power. It's in the hands of global deregulated banks. Governments can decide how much money is printed. They can decide how much of it is flowing around. They can decide what we value and what we don't value. But we want that to happen through a democratic process, and we want to see decentralization or localization at every level. Now, having a vision of where we want to go is also what we're saying is ultimately how local, exactly what is the balance, between the city and the country. Everywhere should be different because diversity is life, and it needs to involve the local population. So we're saying, we're talking about a democratic process which understands that we are nature and nature is the economy. But other than that, the exact specifics need to be worked out. But there's more to say. I hope you read my book, Local is Our Future, where I say it between.
Thanks, Helena. We have the next bit from Aparna. You can talk. You can disable your mic and you can talk, Aparna.
Hello?
Yes, you're audible. Go ahead, yes.
Yeah, hi, good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, I'm an architect based out of Bangalore.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking about this whole local community and global community at large, but this question is related in terms of housing.
Yeah.
So how these global corporations act and how these large builders act and how people's psychological and physiological behavior is different from the ones who are living in close-knit communities, such as people living in slums.
Yeah.
So people living in slums have a much more connected lifestyle and they are interdependent.
Yeah.
And you mentioned in your conversation that there is a lot of disintegration in the community and it's causing a gap between communities because of globalization.
Yeah.
So what is your take on how this problem can be solved or how this gap can be bridged, wherein people are more open towards each other nowadays rather than keeping themselves inside nuclear shells?
Well, this is, again, it's hard not to say it in too long a way, but I've been saying recently that we've been in lockdown in nuclear families for a long time now, particularly in the West. And what that means is that as people were essentially, as I said earlier, it was by force originally, even in England, through the enclosures, people were driven off the land. When they lived in smaller towns and communities on the land, they had social structures where they were dependent on each other to manage the water, the land, the farming. There were relationships, businesses. Some people had a bit more money, some people less, but they were interdependent with each other. As they were pushed into Dickensian London, suddenly they were no longer dependent on each other. They were dependent on remote, business and government bodies. And this has become worse and worse, so that now the dependence is, if you're lucky in many government offices or businesses, now you get to talk to a robot or you get to talk to someone on the other side of the world. And so you're more and more removed from everything you depend on. Now, what you said about that interdependence in the slums is something I remember reflecting on many years ago when I'd been in Delhi and I'd seen people in the slums and seen people sleeping on the streets in Delhi. And then I was in New York a few months later and I wondered why did my heart ache even more for the person on the street in New York than it did in Delhi? And I suddenly realized, oh my God, even on the street sleeping, people were doing it in community. And it was, again, intergenerational community, which you might think is horrible, that there were children and old people, but actually they at least had each other. Whereas the completely alone, totally cut off individual there sleeping on the streets was just so heartbreaking. So again and again for me, so much of what we have to do is to rethink a lot of assumptions about progress, about poverty, about what really constitutes wealth. And this lockdown in nuclear families that is happening also in India, not to the same extent, but is a really terrible thing, because what happens is that it's only inside those four walls, with usually four people, maybe, husband, wife, and children, we get this very intense dependence on each other to answer all these needs that when you were in a larger family, you didn't have that same intensity. And that meant that it was able to be much more balanced, much more easygoing. Every mother would have at least 3, 4, maybe 10 people helping to look after every baby. And in the really traditional indigenous situation in Ladakh, they really did have, about 10 people. Because even the 5-year-old brother would be carrying his baby sister on his back. And of course, that meant that it was so much easier. And honestly, for probably about the first decade or something in Ladakh, maybe not quite as long as a decade, but certainly the first 5, 6 years, you almost never heard a baby cry. And then gradually, I said, with the nuclear family and with the stresses and strain, and people, anyway, I hope you look at our film, Ancient Futures, if you haven't, if you don't know that. We show there the madness of what happens when we calculate everything according to GDP and monetary progress. It's just totally meaningless. Someone living in a slum, maybe a single mother, or she has a husband, he's off working all the time, and in this crowded condition, and yet, because he might be earning $1 a day, in the statistics, we're being told how well off, India is and China now because of economic growth, when in fact for most people they're actually poorer in terms of how hard they have to work to just put food on the table and have a roof over their head and have clean water. So what do we do? So first of all, is to really re-examine this and examining with all the assumptions and really try to get a baseline. But I also just want to say that one difficult thing is that many people in India and as well as in America or Sweden, when they go to small communities now, they often think, oh, I wouldn't want to live here. It's so dead and so small-minded. And the truth is, I wouldn't want to live in the Ladakhi villages anymore, because almost everything has been pulled into the city, and what's left behind is marginalized people, marginalized living, and the power, the money, and with it often the culture has been drained away. So very few people have experienced what I experienced, in Ladakh in the early days, the amazing richness of music and dancing and theatre. Amazing how much was done right at the local level, and seeing the extreme. I'm not saying we all want to go back to the tiny village, although I have to say the tiny villages in Ladakh back in the early days were just so alive and rich that I would definitely prefer to be reborn as a traditional Ladakhi rather than as a modern Westerner. But anyway, so I just want to also warn against thinking that if you go into the local small town or community, almost anywhere in the world now, this is not what we're talking about. What you actually need to look at is what I call the new local. And the new local, to some extent, is happening in India too, and in some ways more extremely in America, where people who really went up the ladder and were living in, the city and very successful, felt the emptiness, the lack of connection, lack of community, lack of contact with nature, and consciously decided to choose real wealth, real connection, real community, real contact with nature. Many of them going to actually farm, but many of them moving to smaller towns or cities like Portland, Oregon, or, there are many places, which also in India now, there'll be certain ones that are hotbeds for people who are sort of coming back from the big city. So in order to dissuade planners and, to start lobbying government also for some changes in regulations. So for instance, that you could start to, as an architect, ideally you'd be working with town planners, you'd be working with people concerned with food, you'd be working with people concerned with health, you'd be looking at a truly holistic, interdisciplinary way of how can we make genuine human and ecological well-being thrive? How can we create thriving places? And that requires this multidisciplinary approach. And ultimately, we want massive changes in education and training so that even as an architect, you'll be thinking more broadly. And of course, some specialization can be helpful, but we've way overdone. So then you'd be looking at how, you can build a sort of a development that has some kind of land associated with it. But if economically people are completely enslaved to the dominant system, there won't be the thriving and alive business aspect and farming aspect and cultural aspect. So you have to, try to look at it holistically, but certainly, trying to work with local materials. And of course, your question was more about the community. And there, what we see is, maybe I didn't say that clearly enough, is really raising awareness about the importance of community and starting a process of community building that understands that people have to be willing to be more vulnerable. They've been trained now in the nuclear family to become so intensely dependent on each other, and often there's a lot of unhappiness with that, and even addiction and abuse, and then to the outside world, you're supposed to be perfect, and you're not allowed to express the problems that you're facing. And we've got to start that as a community effort. There's now more and more talk about this in the West, about the need to be vulnerable. Many people who talk about it don't understand the link to the economic structures and so on, but at least there's a clear recognition that in order to connect more deeply and to create more community, we have to be willing to show both our, what people call the shadow side, which I see not as an inevitable part of human nature, but we have all of us huge shadows, much bigger shadows, because we've been put into a system that doesn't suit us and that creates neuroses and shadows. The biggest neurosis is that none of us in the nuclear family got the amount of love and care that we need. I would say none of us. And so please remember that psychology that now is being studied all around the world. It comes out of studying 6 societies. Freud is starting with, this urban, completely neurotic society. And then that's how we're supposed to learn about mental health. So that's where I feel myself, I would like to, I've always wanted to write more because I feel very qualified to at least try to put something down about what actually constitutes genuine mental health and how can we structure our society so that we don't end up so troubled. And, the trouble, of course, also is escalating into now, epidemics of anxiety among young people. I mean, the anxiety is just, it's the majority now. Majority of young people, depression, addiction, and even suicide, epidemics of suicide among young people. And in virtually every country, I don't know a single country where it's not going up very significantly. So when we talk about community, let's start by trying to appeal to people's concern about their children, and let's start by providing a much more global understanding of what's happening. Because otherwise people remain trapped in trying to hide any of the problems in their own family, or feeling, they're so imperfect, blaming themselves, blaming their own children, or they might blame their own government. But they're not seeing, wow, this is happening from Sweden to Ladakh to, Korea and Japan, where it's absolutely terrible. What is this? It's a global problem for a global reason. What is that reason? That's, we really need to be willing to study that global system and to see the impacts globally, to remove the self-blame and the narrow focus. We're trapped in a political frame right now which doesn't go anywhere, because it doesn't deal with the real human, the real ecological, and the real economic issues. We're not dealing with them. They get covered up. I was almost screaming the other day when I had to listen to, I wanted to listen to a BBC special podcast called The Real Story, and it was about food and what's happening to that with this COVID pandemic. And they mentioned, at some point, they were also going to say, would localizing make sense? And then the entire framing, they have experts, and including an expert from Britain who is a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, but as he's gone up the ladder, he's sort of being careful. And it was just unbelievable. First of all, the whole discussion of food does not say anything about the global businesses that are controlling the global food market. It's all about China importing and exporting, like countries are really in control of the real power, no mention of these global players. So it gets a completely distorted impression, which, by the way, also happens in the climate discussions. And they talk about a country's ecological footprint, their carbon footprint. It's a joke. If you're going to look at the carbon footprint of a country now, you've got to go around to factories in China and Indonesia and God knows where to see how much energy was used there to produce it, how much was used to transport it. So to talk about a country's carbon footprint is a joke. But people who are doing it, most of them, all of them, I would say, it's not through evil intention, but it's this blindness and this subtle way of people feeling a bit uncomfortable about talking about big business in this way. And as I was saying, if we can have that global view, whether it's of the food, so in this food program, also just to say that in that entire program where we were promised we were going to hear something about local, it was lasted for about a minute or something, because it was more or less dismissed when they said, well, wouldn't it be better then to have more local food and to create more local food economies? And then one of the experts said, oh, no, consumers, they want their strawberries in winter. The consumers wouldn't put up with it. By the way, that's another ghastly myth that's put out all the time, is that the individual consumers and their choices are what are shaping this situation. They are not shaping it. It's being shaped by big business, working with big government, and then consumers respond. So when you make it very expensive to buy fresh, local, organic, and a lot cheaper to buy a non-organic from the other side of the world, yes, many people will do that. When you make it, very difficult and very expensive to find natural materials for clothing, and costing is sometimes 10 times as much, people will buy the synthetic fiber. But they are not the drivers. That's another, really important thing to think about as we rethink these assumptions and as we think about which way forward. But the way, we're planning to organize, probably in July, what we're calling a World Localization Day. A World Localization Day. And we're planning to have online conferences rolling the whole 24 hours. And I hope you will join and help, because we want to also have allies that we certify to be putting on some of the localization agenda on the web in their community, so that there'll be many, many, many things going on. So I hope you'll help us to do that, to try to get more of the discussion out and more people aware that there is this other path that is not theory, because all these tiny grassroots initiatives are showing that we can be more productive with diversified local food systems. We can produce far more per unit of land than we can in any monoculture. So if you take a square meter of land, you take 100,000 hectares of land, and you just plant one thing on one of them, or diversity on the other, the diversified will always, always, everywhere, in the Middle East, wherever you care to mention, be able to produce more per unit of land and water. So that is vastly more efficient. But in order for that to happen, you have to shorten the distance between the farm and the market. Now, how short? That's also a question of how we change regulations and how we make things possible. But you see, when it comes to the natural world, and that means farming, forestry, fishery, the real economy, and for these basic, fundamental, primary production, which provide our most essential needs, for that, we have to completely change this lie of efficiencies of scale. Efficiencies of scale only exist in the man-made industrial world. There, yes, if you want to produce bicycles or plastic toys or cars or whatever, there, oh sorry, excuse me. Hello? Yeah, sorry. It's Lauren. I do, sorry. I'm very sorry. So I should have unplugged that, maybe I can. No, I couldn't find it. I don't think that phone landline, most people don't use anymore. But what I was going to say is that the truth about efficiencies of scale when it comes to farming and so on is that, yes, there's an efficiency of scale in the natural world, and it's the smaller the better, and the more people the better. And that means that on this crowded planet, for me, this is one of the most important things we're trying to get people to think about. We have a very crowded planet, and in order to heal the planet and ourselves, we need more people per acre of land, per forest, fishing, more people, because we have to pay so much attention now to make sure that we don't do what the industrial fishing nets do, which, you know, they can take out of the sea the equivalent of, I think it's 15 jumbo jets, just one swoop, and then they throw half of it back dead. The immense waste, the inefficiency of this system is criminal. But because these industrial systems have managed to destroy so much, we now need the human systems to care gently for every earthworm, for every bit of soil, for every sapling, every seed. So we really need a mass mobilization back to the land. And that's not to say that, you know, everyone wants to or will need to be back on the land, but as we have this huge train pushing us away from the land, We need now to be pushing in exactly the opposite direction. And what we're seeing is that when people are in large numbers, like on some of the small, diversified, organic farms that are part of the local food movement, people love it. I mean, it is so heartening to see prisoners, juvenile delinquents, restless children actually changing from having that connection, that opportunity. And then, you can see people long for the connection to life. You probably don't see it so much in India, but in the West, I mean, just bringing a dog to a school has been seen as a therapy for restless children. Bringing a dog into an old people's home. People are so desperate for connecting to life. And I used to say already in the mid-70s, when I came back from Ladakh to Sweden, and I could see how important it was for us to live in a larger group of people. At that time, already in the mid-70s, half of all the dwellings in Stockholm, there was one person living alone. And already then, people realized that loneliness was one of the main reasons for alcoholism, depression, and suicide. And even having a goldfish in a little glass bowl could help people to extend their well-being in their lives. So, yeah. Anyway, but I have another question. I can go on forever.
All right. So a lot of questions that's coming up. I'll kind of sum up some of the questions here. So they're asking, how do you take this idea of localization or self-sufficiency to the younger generation, especially to universities and colleges? Are there any tools or any practices that you have tried and that you have followed to take it up to the younger generation? That's one. Other question was also the influence of Mahatma Gandhi, on you, if he has influenced you and your views on Mahatma Gandhi. We'll just take these two for now.
Yeah, but in terms of taking it to students and to universities, we hope that our film, The Economics of Happiness, is useful. It is being used. It's being used around the world. It's in 23 or more languages now. And so it's been a very useful tool to start a discussion, and it's still very relevant. We're hoping to do more. But what we're finding is that even at a very young age, also the Ancient Futures film has worked well and has been used in schools and made young people think about this huge transition away from the land and the idea that money isn't necessarily what makes you happy. So I also feel that we shouldn't focus too much on just the young. I'm trying to say, generally speaking, that I'm expecting the sort of middle-aged, middle-class people to be far more active. And young are feeling enormous psychological pressures. They're being funneled into this incredibly competitive career path. And as we know, everywhere in the world now, where the jobs are, which is the big cities, the house prices are just completely astronomical. And so, they're condemned to spend hours in getting the transport to work, and they're condemned into also very insecure positions. They're afraid. They think they're just under intense heat and pressure to keep working harder and harder and prove that they're willing to work 80 hours a week, because otherwise someone else will come along and take their job. So it's just a crazy, crazy situation. So I want people who are maybe retired or at least a little more comfortable and secure to take it as their responsibility to help force through what is a dominated media now, where the questioning of the role of big business does not get out. The media themselves are big business. So we have a really big task to get out a very commonsensical picture. This is not about blaming big business, not about demonizing people who work there. And very often people who might work in a big business feel reluctant to say something, or they feel they have to leave big business before they can even criticize it. It's not like that. We're all dependent on this system. All of us have our money in banks or whatever that. We don't know what they're doing with it. We're paying taxes to this system. So we're all in this boat, basically. So it's not a question of becoming pure and clean and, having nothing to do with this. It's impossible. So it doesn't matter if you're inside big business or outside, it doesn't matter where you are, you can help to join and support the discussion. Because we really are talking about survival now, and we're talking about this crisis, about the possibility of not having another chance, or the possibility that this crisis will take us towards this electronic money, which will destroy small business, towards more and more fear of health hazards, so we'll be disconnected using the screen, more and more dependent on robots that are being romanticized by big business and being romanticized by a lot of people who just haven't thought clearly about what it means. It's a very, very, it's a big fork, this crisis now, and we have a pause button right now that could help us really explore. I don't expect at all that all of you listening to what I'm saying that you're going to agree with me. But the big thing I hope is that you would be willing to explore further. And yes, if you are at universities and if you're interested in reaching young people, that we have materials, we have tools for some of the films and books we've done, and links to other groups that could be used, and that would be, would be very helpful to do that. But I would also say, even if you are a student at university, try also to see if you can help to educate some of your elders. Maybe that's more difficult. Or in any case, I would say whatever you do, try to change the I to a we, so you're not going at it alone. Because when you're just thinking, what can I do, it so limits you. And when you start working with others, it becomes more enjoyable, and you get the courage to look at the bigger picture and to think bigger about what you might be able to do. And Gandhi, absolutely. I mean, I was not influenced by Gandhi in terms of starting the work in Ladakh, but very soon thereafter, I don't think I was that familiar with Gandhi, actually. I was quite Western before I went to Ladakh. And of course, as I came to know about Gandhi from being in Ladakh and so on, it was so clear that it was something, very, very similar to what he was talking about. And yet I found that the climate had changed so much in India and in the West that even talking about Ladakh, I felt I had to be a bit careful. And talking about Gandhi, in the same way I worried that it would sound like I was saying that we all have to go back to the village and, just wear a loincloth, and that many people wouldn't listen if I used Ladakh as too much of an example. And I've always been torn about that and keep going back and forth, because that's like my Bible, that's the experience. And none of this comes from me. It totally just comes from my having seen these changes that then opened my eyes. And so even today, I don't know in India or even in other countries whether it's wise to use Gandhi as the main symbol or voice for what we're doing. I feel that his wisdom and his understanding was, it exceeded Schumacher, I feel. And I feel in both cases, what I'd like to say about Gandhi, as well as Schumacher, as well as all the people I respect, they had experience both of the Western system and of something more traditional. And this is what I've found is almost necessary to see these two paths that we're talking about. Sadly, most of the leaders I know, and that includes David Corton, an American economist who was completely, studied Harvard and Stanford, and then he went out to bring the great American dream to the rest of the world and lived in Southeast Asia and had his eyes opened and wrote a book called When Corporations Rule the World. He's one of the wisest living economists now. And so it's this experience that's very important. I'm just hoping that through films and books and, now everybody can't experience it, that just thinking things through. And I believe it's something like gardening, even planting 2 seeds in the soil and seeing how differently they grow, being more deeply connected to nature can help open our eyes to the need to respect diversity. What does that mean? Being closer to it. So I hope that there are other avenues, and I don't know. I wonder what other people think. Whether we were even today actually talking about when we said World Localization Day. And we were actually thinking, when was Gandhi's birthday? Because maybe we should do it on Gandhi's birthday. And then, anyway, it turned out it's not till October. So then we thought, well, and then also I had that second thought about whether that is really the best way to present it. It might push away too many people who are not quite there yet, but who might be open to protecting and supporting the local worldwide, not some narrow, selfish protection, but protecting the earth, protecting our health, protecting our livelihoods as a human right worldwide. That's the message we want to give.
So the other question, a lot of youngsters are posting and consolidating and giving the gist of it. I think I'm in my 20s, and because of my exposure, I understand the idea of localization and self-sufficiency. But how do we convince our parents of the paths that we want to follow? Because that seems to be the most difficult one, and convincing family members especially seems very, very difficult. Do you have any views or idea on that as the question?
Well, one thing I do think is in terms of trying to convince, again, I would urge you to start to try to create a bit of a group. So that first group is not always likely to be your family. Sometimes it's just like-minded people that you find. You can show a film and then after the showing say, would people like to join in a group, and to try to hold up a flag that you really feel we've got to reassess this direction of so-called progress. But then, once you're part of a group, then maybe you'll have tools and the means to bring more awareness, more information. I think, especially in India, I think they need to get much more information about what's happening in America, in other countries. So just like everybody needs to have a more global perspective, because otherwise they remain too narrowly focused. So like the extreme is, when DDT was being introduced into Ladakh, nobody had information about the fact that it had been banned in the West. And the same thing, building a hospital basically out of asbestos and people beginning to bake their bread on asbestos, and then there was no knowledge about it. And even educated Indian officers at that time, that, you're worried about asbestos, but it's not a problem. But they just didn't have enough information about what had happened in other parts of the world. So I think broadening the picture is what I call big picture activism. And part of the big picture is to get more information from around the world, which hopefully can then be more persuasive. And remember, it's not just about the big picture in terms of the problem, but also in terms of this really growing localization movement, how many things are happening. There are government changes now, usually at the regional level, some city mayors. We work closely with the mayor of Seoul in South Korea, and with several mayors in Tokyo, and the mayor of Bristol in the UK. So there's trickling upwards. There is now even policy change because the reality on the ground shows so clearly we have to change direction. So it's just a question of presenting as much evidence as possible.
Let's do Athena.
Yeah.
You can go.
Yeah. Hi. So I don't know how relatable my question is to you and your area, but I'm still curious to know what you would think of my question. So here goes. A year back, I was going for an exam. I was on my way to exam and I was running a little late. And on my way, I came across a calf limping, struggling to walk on the side of the highway. And as it was a highway, big buses and vehicles were speeding. And I saw that the calf, one of its legs were injured and it could not walk. So in any time, any big bus or truck could just hit the calf. So I was on my way to exam, as I told you. So I was stuck there. I didn't know what to do because I was late. And I thought to myself, what should I do? But finally, I decided to just save the calf. And I went on. But luckily, I was able to write my exam with some warnings, of course. But after the exam, I was left with this question, what if I had missed my exam? So my question is, if I could relate to your area of economics of personal, social, and ecological well-being, and which one of these two, would be the true education if I had only these two options, like saving the calf, the helpless calf, and having missed the exam, or writing the exam well, passing with flying colors, but doing nothing about the injured calf like all the others that I'd seen on the highway.
Well, I would say that very important for us is that you don't look at the issues from that individual perspective, that part of the big picture is to step back and look at what can we do to change things. So the individual in that situation that's just filled with difficult choices, and you're not going to change the world, you're not going to change the system by just helping that one calf. And you're probably not going to change the world either by going and getting flying colors on your exam. And so really, this is for us extremely important that we move away from this emphasis on individual choices within that narrow context. Ultimately, it is up to us as individuals. And ultimately, it is individuals which will change. And there's a very, very important work to be done individually in terms of our inner environment, in terms of learning to meditate, in terms of learning to really relax our whole nervous system and be more gentle on ourselves and on others. We need lots of practices now to help develop enough self-love and enough self-confidence that we can genuinely be loving and caring for others. But all the time, what we're encouraging is that we, yes, take on practices like that, but when it comes to questions like you just asked, understand that we urgently need to be questioning the bigger direction of our society as a society. And at the very smallest level, we're hoping that you will join in with community initiative. We, for the last what is it now? It's about 30 years that deregulation has given big business so much power, we've been more and more trained to look at the world through these narrow lenses, and we've been trained to think of ourselves as consumers. And we didn't hear in the climate change debate, we didn't hear that our governments, by supporting this globalizing path, were massively increasing emissions. And in the meanwhile, it was all about how we should drive our car less, how we should be, not going on holiday, and this narrow focus on the individual, and making people feel guilty. Also now in the environmental movement, there's a big discussion about the psychology. It's like the whole framing now is, oh, people don't want to change, people don't care. They didn't realize that from the beginning of the environmental movement, we were very clear that we needed policy change. In other words, we need to change collectively. Collectively as a society, we need to decide to move in another direction. If we try to do it as individuals, we are absolutely doomed to fail, and it is failing. And that's because we have been for 30 years now trained to think, if I recycle the plastic, or maybe I shouldn't save that car, or maybe I shouldn't work in this business, or maybe I. We can make changes at the community level now, but even that is not enough. We need to, particularly in the light of this pandemic and the threat of a complete rejection of democracy and a world that is run for profit. That's what we have to move away from, and that's a very big ask, but it requires, that we look at the bigger picture to seek ways of doing what we can do. And one of the biggest things we can do is to share the big picture. You can help to get this out. You can help with our materials and other similar materials to get this out so that more people see that there is another way that's being built. It's not theory. Localization is not just theory. It's happening. And we don't get to hear about it. So big picture activism, you could, if you're a musician, you could even just have link some of your website or whatever to materials that question the direction of society. You might also have a song about it, but even if you don't, you can use your visibility, your platform to help start this bigger discussion. We don't have much time, so it's urgent. And the urgency is, how can we learn to slow down? That's a very urgent question. How can we learn to promote small on a large scale? So how can we actually grow the localization initiative, not by growing individual businesses or individual cities, but multiplying the number of places and the number of people who can actually come back into balance with nature and balance with each other.
Okay, how much more time do you have? A lot of questions pouring in. How much more time do you have?
Well, I have been told 2 hours. So I can speak
for another half an hour, right?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, not quite. Let's say another 15 minutes.
Okay. All right. Right. So there's this question that says, what are the practices and tools that you follow every day to keep you rooted and grounded and to believe and to keep pushing forward every day amidst everything that is happening right now in the world?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I don't do as much gardening as I feel I should or want to, because I do enjoy it. But I've ended up getting my balance by walking in nature, and it's sort of, I like walking alone. Very often I'll go off with my husband or somebody else. And even now here, we're allowed to do that. We're allowed to walk with another person. But I then prefer to walk alone a lot of the time. I find that I feel this amazing spiritual and joyous feeling being in nature. And I'm very lucky we live near the sea. It's magnificently beautiful. But I even, I think even if you just lie under a tree and you just really this is a practice I try to encourage people to do, is to also encourage their children to have the brief of simply trying to feel how you're part of that, you're connected to that, and to admire the beauty of it. I just find almost every aspect of nature so beautiful and so inspiring. I love also just watching the sky. And I remember even as a young person, I used to joke about many of my Western colleagues or friends. They tended to be like bird watchers, and then they were wanting to label every bird, and I felt it had become a way of showing off, and that wasn't actually enjoyable. And so I used to joke about starting a cloud watchers club. It wouldn't be possible to keep labeling every cloud. So there is this more meditative way of being, which means shutting down the chattering mind and just being in the present. And for me, doing that in nature, that's what really recharges me. And I have to say, being able to talk to you today, it helps to recharge my batteries, to know there are people who are interested. And every day, almost, in my inbox or whatever, I do get positive, not necessarily about us, but I'll get examples of really inspiring initiatives. And Ladakh gave me this complete conviction that human beings actually long for love and connection. I've seen how this system perverts that into making children believe that if they want to have approval and love, they've got to have the latest iPad and look the smartest and have the PhD and be rich and be famous. All of these false signals telling them divide and compete and you'll be happy. No, it's exactly the opposite. Connect and collaborate is how you'll be happier. And so the evidence is there, and so I feel very motivated, and that sustains me, my absolutely eternal conviction that we want something else, and that the main problem is blindness. And one other thing too that I learned from Ladakh that's been really nice is that took me until I was 60 to actually practice, and that was seeing that in Ladakh, as in most traditional cultures, people sang and danced and made music together. And so I started, very thinking, I can't sing, because that's how most Westerners have been brought up now. You have to be a star or you're nobody. So, I didn't think I could sing, and I was doing, but I started joining groups singing, and I really, really enjoy that. It's a very spiritual and connecting and deeply satisfying to chant or sing together, not to be being the star, but actually as you feel the tone going through your body, it's one of the most clear senses of being at one. And it turns out, actually now, there's all kinds of evidence from neuroscience and so on, that when we do that, it has this amazing healing effect on our emotions and on our nervous system. So it's to be highly, highly recommended as one of the practices that we can do. And one more thing about that, it's interesting because it's really so much more satisfying doing it in person. And so I belong to several singing groups. So normally 3 times a week I will be part of that, but now we can't. And then this woman started one on the web, and we tried to sing, on Zoom together. It doesn't work at all. But what we developed now is that it really works really well, and that is that the woman who leads it, she sings and she mutes us, but then we are singing with her. So we still get that sense of singing with someone, and the tone is expanded. So it's so much better than singing alone. And then we also see each other and say hello and so on. So I recommend that also for you if you're in lockdown.
Next question. The question is, most people are aware about all these things. Most people are being taught in schools and colleges, if they have workshops or some awareness campaigns of some kind. But awareness is not really leading into action. Then what is the next stage of transition from awareness is the question.
Well, I would first of all argue that most people are not aware of what I'm saying. So, in fact, I get that comment very regularly. And it's very frustrating also, even this yesterday, talking to a friend who I love and who is so close to where I am, but he still really doesn't get it. And yet he thinks he does. So it's so difficult. And if I tell you, if I tell you examples of that, there's lots of them. He thinks many of the sort of green solutions that we dismiss because we see them as reinforcing this overall system we're trying to raise awareness about. But then the person who tells me, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're saying, and the awareness is there, but they're supporting all kinds of things that are actually reinforcing the whole system we want to move away from. And they hold on to very much this individualized view of things. So I would say no, most people are not aware of this. And I would say that and when I say this, I'm talking about this holistic, systemic view, both of the path taking us away from nature and community and the path taking us forward, and particularly the structures that facilitate one over the other. And that has to do with that towards localization. To actually make this possible, we have to bring the techno-economic side of it in line with what is actually, I would say, real signs of a global cultural turning that's been going on for quite a while, where more and more people question this destruction of nature. They question, yes, they don't like big business having so much power, but most of them have never heard of the trade treaties as being the main path. But people are clearly showing a desire for a better balance between humans and nature. They're showing greater respect for the feminine and women. They're showing greater love and respect for animals. And yet that cultural turning has not translated into the same large-scale demand for economic change, and particularly economic change also dealing with technology. So we didn't talk so much about technology today. It's a very tricky issue, but it's a very important part of it. We really need to be rejecting the path that's telling us that robots are needed for farming and for medicine. We have to be really aware that it's a path that's going to concentrate and globalize and extract wealth, widen the gap, and make us more unecological and inhuman. That's what it is, inhuman. So, I think that the awareness raising that people talk about, and it's very common now to say, particularly around climate, people don't learn from information. It's not about information. It's not about awareness. There's something else that has to happen. That I completely disagree with. I'm saying people are not aware that there's a weird way that all the focus has been on them as individuals, as consumers. And they've been told if they change their consumer choices, they're going to end climate change. They've been told they shouldn't drive their car. Climate change will go away. No, they haven't been informed. They haven't been aware. They haven't been told that there's been this huge, particularly in the era of information about climate change, in the last 30 years, is precisely when there's been this huge shift towards industry moving around the world making the entire globe their production facility, and distributing and shipping and flying food and water back and forth. Right now, Australia exports 20 tons of bottled water to the UK. UK exports 20 tons of bottled water to Australia. That's a tiny, tiny blip every day. And every day this has been going on. Flying fish to China to be deboned and flying back again. I'm really wondering why we're not hearing a peep about that during the pandemic. I don't know what's going on. We know for a fact, even right here where I'm in Australia, macadamia nuts are flown to China to be cracked open, flown back again. Why is there nothing in the media about what's happened to that food industry? We hear about industrial production slowing down. It's very strange, but what is definitely clear is that in the era of climate change, when we should have been saying, immediately stop flying things across the world to be processed. Let's do it at home. We'll massively reduce emissions. Immediately stop subsidizing the global trade of food so that things from the other side of the world are cheaper. If we had just stopped swapping identical products, emissions would have gone down systemically. But we didn't even hear about that. And now we get all this blabber about how information isn't enough and people don't care and people don't learn. And we have to have some magical thing of telling stories, and the more personal, the better. Personal stories and experiential knowledge. I was previously saying experiential knowledge is very important, but that was experiential knowledge of different ways of living, different cultural ways of living, and that would be very helpful. But now in the climate debate, this idea that people would learn from information is just completely wrong. And I hope you help to get out the information about how, if we're going to deal with it, of course we have to localize. Of course we have to, instead of lengthening the distance between the farm and the table, which is what our governments are doing every day, further and further and further. Of course we have to shorten it. And of course we have to move away from monoculture. And don't fall for talking about regenerative agriculture, because it's being used in a single issue way. It doesn't say anything except soil. We need a systemic view. If we're going to use one word, it should be diversity. But we don't want to use one word. We want to show that shorter distances and diversity go together. And shorter distances means less transport, less packaging, less plastic, and less insanity in the food system. So the food system, by the way, in order to really, really get what I'm trying to say, one of the best places to start is to study the food system and to really understand the global food system versus these millions of people now working in more localized food systems, and to see the difference there. And that really is a truth, it's a reality that is very, very hard to manipulate, but it's being manipulated. It's being manipulated primarily because in the media, we don't get to talk about it. So the biggest threat is just the exclusion of just keeping out some of these basic realities.
I think during the time, I will take the last question myself. So I want to know a list of 5 books and 5 documentaries that have made a great impact on you, and you believe that all of us should definitely read and watch these documentaries, and 5 each.
Okay, thank you. Well, as I mentioned, certainly in terms of books, Schumacher's Small is Beautiful had a very, very big impact. And I also mentioned David Corton, When Corporations Rule the World. And I would say that in terms of books that made a really big impression on me, that really made a big impression on me. I have to think, because you see, the book was this book of life of Ladakh, you know, so they were, well, actually, no, before Ladakh, I was very impressed with and influenced by Ivan Illich and his books, you know, Tools of Conviviality and Questioning Schooling, Medicine, and Technology. But later on, I met him, and I was very disappointed because I felt he had sort of narrowed his view, but I loved those early books. And so those books, and so that's about 5, isn't it? But I would also say, when I was young, I was also, I remember that Alan Watts wrote a book called Psychotherapy East and West, and that made a big impression on me, Psychotherapy East and West. And yes, even after Ladakh, I loved Fritjof Capra's Tao of Physics, the Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra. And he became a friend. He's a quantum physicist, and he wrote about how quantum physics was essentially substantiating what the spiritual, particularly Eastern traditions, were spelling out. And equally, another physicist who I loved was someone named Hans-Peter Dürr. And I don't know, he's German, and unfortunately he died. He was a close friend. But he also, as a quantum physicist, was very much exploring and understanding the wisdom from the East in terms of a philosophy that recognized the inextricable oneness of life, the oneness of life. And someone else, now I'm getting too many, but Leopold Kohr. Leopold Kohr was also a friend of mine who wrote about scale. And one of the books that he wrote was called The Breakup of Nations. Another, even before that, was Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm, who he wrote a book called To Have or To Be. But better than that, he wrote another one called Beyond the Chains of Illusion. And there he was talking about industrial society. In terms of documentaries, I would say that most recently I loved and was very thrilled about a new film called The Biggest Little Farm. The Biggest Little Farm. It's very, very good. And it just needs to be bookended with the truth that this diversifying, they took a dead monoculture and diversified. It's very inspiring. And they need to say more clearly that the diversity led to much higher productivity and that it provides many more meaningful livelihoods. And you know, I also was very impressed with Adam Curtis, The Century of the Self. If you haven't heard of Adam Curtis, The Century of the Self. I might have mentioned it. I mentioned before that Avatar, for me, I'd love again to people to bookend it with the understanding that this is spelling out really quite a global awakening to the value of indigenous culture and rejection of corporate culture. Again, you know, it's sort of, you know, corporation is bad, indigenous people good, and that's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying more indigenous or localized way of life is not only healthier, but it's happier, and a more corporate way of life is extremely unhealthy and unhappy. So those ways of life. But Avatar, it was a big Hollywood film, and with that book ending, I think it's a good film to show people. And there's a film called The Man, but again, I would like people to, you know, bookend it with It doesn't have any structural analysis, but it basically shows lots of localization projects around the world.
Thank you so much for this.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I'm glad you're doing it. I hope it'll help.
Yes, definitely. So I will just quickly run you the last 5 minutes of this. Is is my screen shared? Are you guys able to see my screen?
Sorry?
Are you able to see my screen? Is my screen shared?
I can see you. I can see you.
My screen? Are you able to see my screen?
Well, no, I just see your face.
Okay, 1 moment. Now?
Oh, yeah, now I can.
Alright, so this is the economics of happiness in Bangalore in
Oh, yes.
2014, and there are a lot of friends who are here who did not know each other, and after 5 years we got to know through Cuckoo together. There are about 10 people from Cuckoo who are inside this photo.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
that's lovely.
2014.
And do we have a copy of that? Because that would be nice for us to have that.
Yes, I can mail this to you. Yes, I'll do that. Yeah.
Okay. Very nice.
And this again is the same 2014 plan.
Yeah.
And this is the recent one that happened in Ladakh this year.
Yeah.
In 2019. This on your extreme. Yeah, on my extreme right of the screen, this is Sivaraj, one of the founders of the Cuckoo School movement, the Cuckoo Forest School, along with Keibo and Mr. Satish Kumar from the Resurgence London. And that's the happy Cuckoo family in London there.
And is that you next to the sign, standing up?
Here?
Is that you? Is that you? Yeah.
Yeah, that's me. That's me. Yeah. That's me. Yeah. That's sure. Yeah. So there are a few people to thank for today. I'll stop sharing the screen. One especially is Mr. Kamakshi Kavi from Australia as well, who's also a local volunteer with the Local Futures Australia. So thank you so much. And the group which has enabled us to renovate an old well near the Cuckoo Forest School in the village called Ammal Mudiyum group. So a big thanks to both of them. And we'll also have an announcement and also a request to make. One is we will be starting with the Cuckoo movement for the younger generation, which will be called as the Institute of Self-Sustenance and Learning for the younger generation, which is obviously influenced by the Local Futures and the economics of happiness. We'll be starting today. And we also have a request to make that we would be more than happy and glad if the next Economics of Happiness Conference India can happen at the Cuckoo Forest School. We'd be more than delighted if that's the possibility. Yeah, so with that, and to all the participants here who were questions have not been answered, we're really sorry that I was not able to take all the questions that was here. But a big thank you to everybody who had joined us here from different nations and across the globe. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Helena, for being with us for the last 2 hours. It is obviously eye-opening, and I'm sure a lot of people will take up the path of local features and economic services. Thank you so much, Helena.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for your work.